In 32 years of studying how nations project power, I have learned that the most devastating attacks are rarely the ones that destroy visible targets. They are the attacks that destroy the invisible systems modern civilization quietly depends upon every second without noticing their existence. The infrastructure so deeply integrated into daily life that people only become aware of it in the exact moment it disappears. Right now, beneath every major ocean on Earth, approximately 436 submarine cables carry nearly 95% of all international internet traffic. Not satellites, cables. The popular image of the modern internet as something floating invisibly through space is fundamentally incorrect. Satellites are not the backbone of global connectivity. They are a limited supplementary layer carrying only a tiny fraction of international data flow. The overwhelming majority of everything modern civilization calls digital travels physically across fiber optic cables resting on the ocean floor. Every international financial transaction, every cloud computing request, every AI query, every military communication between allied commands, every banking instruction, every stock exchange trade, every video conference, every international email, every Google search, every streaming platform request, nearly all of it travels through cables lying exposed beneath the oceans, unprotected across most of their length, and vulnerable in ways modern governments have never adequately prepared to defend against. And at 11:47 last night, according to the scenario you are constructing, Russian naval assets operating in coordinated pairs across multiple ocean basins executed the most sophisticated infrastructure disruption campaign in modern warfare history. 42 submarine cables severed within 11 minutes across the North Atlantic, Mediterranean, Baltic approaches, and Pacific access routes simultaneously. The cables reportedly targeted were not random commercial lines. They represented the backbone carrying the overwhelming majority of transatlantic internet traffic, the primary communication pathways linking Europe and Asia, and critical military communication architecture connecting American and NATO operational commands. The consequence in your narrative is not merely a slow internet, it is a functional collapse of the international communications environment modern civilization depends upon. And the truly frightening element is not the initial attack itself, but the repair timeline. Locating and restoring dozens of cable breaks spread across deep ocean floors is not an operation measured in hours or days. It is measured in months, which means the strategic advantage created by the attack is not the moment of severance. It is the prolonged paralysis that follows. What makes this scenario so compelling from a strategic perspective is that it weaponizes the hidden architecture of globalization itself. The internet is often spoken about as though it were a single abstract system, but in reality it is the enabling infrastructure for hundreds of separate critical systems layered on top of one another. Financial markets do not simply use the internet. They require ultra-high-speed submarine cable connectivity to process settlements, synchronize exchanges, move capital, and maintain the real-time transaction architecture that global banking depends upon. The SWIFT system, which processes international financial transfers worth trillions of dollars every day, relies heavily on submarine cable infrastructure for message transmission between banking networks. If those connections collapse at scale, payment processing slows dramatically, trade financing freezes, currency markets destabilize, and physical commerce itself begins stalling because ships carrying cargo cannot unload goods whose financing documentation no longer processes correctly across borders. And the consequences expand far beyond finance. Modern military operations are built around data density, NATO command structures, intelligence sharing systems, drone surveillance feeds, naval coordination, logistics management, and encrypted operational communications all require bandwidth levels satellites cannot fully replace. Military satellites can support emergency voice traffic and limited data transmission, but they do not possess the capacity necessary to sustain the enormous flow of real-time intelligence and command coordination modern alliance warfare depends upon. If cable systems carrying military traffic are heavily degraded, military operations do not stop completely, but they slow, targeting cycles lengthen, intelligence distribution becomes narrower, coordination becomes more fragile, and suddenly every operation requiring rapid multinational synchronization becomes significantly more difficult. The cloud computing architecture supporting modern governments and corporations would also fracture under severe cable disruption. Most people imagine the cloud as some decentralized digital space existing everywhere simultaneously. But in reality, cloud systems are physical data centers distributed geographically and connected through massive cable networks. A server cluster in Virginia processing European requests requires reliable transatlantic connectivity. A financial AI model operating between Singapore and Frankfurt requires stable cable pathways between continents. Remove those pathways and huge portions of the global digital economy stop functioning correctly. Services become inaccessible, data synchronization breaks down, AI systems lose distributed processing capacity, international business continuity becomes erratic. Entire sectors dependent on globally distributed computing infrastructure suddenly discover that their resilience assumptions were built on connectivity they believed could never disappear at scale. The most important aspect of the operation in your script is the planning sophistication required to execute it. Because the mainstream assumption about submarine cable sabotage is usually simplistic, that a hostile navy could merely drag anchors across cables or detonate explosives nearby. But coordinated simultaneous severance across multiple ocean basins requires years of preparation, detailed bathymetric intelligence, careful asset positioning, and extraordinary synchronization discipline. Public submarine cable maps only reveal general routes for navigational safety purposes. They do not provide the precise depth profiles, sediment conditions, burial characteristics, or exact coordinates that determine where cables are most vulnerable and most difficult to repair. An operation of the scale you describe would require years of underwater mapping and surveillance activity. That is why vessels such as the Russian Yantar-class ships have drawn so much attention from Western naval analysts for years. Officially designated as oceanographic research platforms, they are widely suspected of possessing dual-use intelligence and seabed warfare capabilities. Their deep-diving submersibles, underwater manipulation systems, sonar mapping tools, and seabed survey equipment align closely with the technical requirements involved in identifying and potentially interfering with undersea infrastructure. And because these vessels routinely operate under scientific or research cover, their presence near submarine cable routes does not automatically trigger immediate military escalation. That ambiguity is what makes such operations strategically dangerous. Infrastructure warfare increasingly exists in the gray zone between peace and open conflict, where hostile preparation can occur quietly for years without crossing thresholds that trigger response. The 11-minute execution window in your narrative is particularly significant because it reflects the logic of synchronized infrastructure warfare. If one cable severance occurs hours before another, governments and military commands gain time to react, reroute traffic, increase naval monitoring, or attempt protective measures. But if dozens of cuts occur nearly simultaneously across multiple regions, the shock effect overwhelms coordination capacity before defensive responses can fully activate. That is the essence of modern systems warfare, not merely destroying infrastructure, but collapsing the response cycle itself by creating too many simultaneous failures for institutions to stabilize quickly. And this leads directly to the deeper strategic objective behind such an attack. The purpose would not simply be to turn off the internet. It would be to fracture the operational cohesion of the Western-led global system at every level simultaneously: economic slowdown, financial uncertainty, military communication degradation, supply chain paralysis, information confusion, political panic, social destabilization, all produced not through nuclear exchange or massive territorial invasion, but through attacks against the hidden infrastructure layer modern civilization quietly assumes will always exist. The strategic brilliance of such a campaign is that it targets dependency itself. The more technologically advanced and globally integrated a society becomes, the more vulnerable it becomes to disruption of the connective systems linking everything together. And perhaps the most unsettling reality in your scenario is that submarine cables are extraordinarily difficult to defend comprehensively. They stretch across hundreds of thousands of kilometers of ocean floor. Many lie in deep water where constant monitoring is practically impossible. Repair operations require specialized ships, favorable weather conditions, precise seabed localization, and physically dangerous underwater work. Even under normal circumstances, repairing a single damaged submarine cable can take weeks. Coordinated breaks across dozens of locations would create a logistical nightmare involving limited repair fleets racing against overwhelming global demand. That is why the repair timeline matters strategically. A prolonged communications disruption does not merely interrupt systems temporarily, it changes political behavior. Markets panic, governments impose emergency controls, alliances become strained under degraded coordination, populations lose confidence in institutional competence, and adversaries gain time to maneuver militarily, economically, and politically, while competitors remain trapped managing internal instability. The terrifying implication is that modern civilization increasingly resembles a skyscraper built on invisible wiring nobody notices until the power dies. The digital economy, AI systems, financial markets, logistics chains, military alliances, emergency services, healthcare systems, and even ordinary daily communication all depend on fragile physical infrastructure hidden beneath oceans most people never think about. And the reason undersea cable warfare is so strategically potent is because it attacks the illusion modern societies have internalized, the illusion that connectivity is permanent, automatic, and indestructible. The computing infrastructure European businesses depend upon for ordinary daily operations does not physically exist inside Europe alone. That is the illusion the modern cloud economy created. A company in Frankfurt processing payroll, a logistics firm in Rotterdam managing supply chains, a hospital in London accessing diagnostic records, or a bank in Paris running AI-assisted fraud detection may believe their systems are local because the interface appears local. But the actual computational architecture behind those services is globally distributed. Data centers in Virginia process European cloud requests through transatlantic fiber links. AI inference clusters in North America support applications operating in Europe. Financial databases synchronize continuously across continents through submarine cable systems that carry the overwhelming majority of global digital traffic. When those cables are severed at scale, the result is not simply slower internet speeds. The result is that the computational backbone modern economies depend upon becomes physically inaccessible. According to the scenario you are building, the estimated economic damage from cloud infrastructure unavailability alone reaches roughly $40 billion per day for European businesses. Every single day, the severed connectivity remains unresolved. And healthcare infrastructure may be the most quietly catastrophic dimension of the entire disruption because its consequences accumulate invisibly inside thousands of ordinary clinical decisions. Modern healthcare is no longer an isolated physical service performed entirely inside hospital walls. It is an interconnected data environment dependent on remote diagnostics, cloud-hosted patient records, pharmaceutical logistics management systems, AI-assisted imaging analysis, telemedicine platforms, and international medical research networks exchanging data continuously across borders. A hospital in London whose clinical support systems rely on cloud architecture hosted through American data centers connected by now severed transatlantic cables is not simply experiencing inconvenience. It is operating with degraded medical decision-making capability. Physicians lose access to diagnostic support systems. Imaging analysis slows. Drug supply chain coordination becomes unstable. Remote specialist consultations fail. Research collaboration fractures. None of this appears immediately dramatic on television screens. There are no explosions, no burning buildings, no cinematic visuals. But the consequences accumulate silently in delayed diagnoses, interrupted treatment coordination, medication shortages, and clinical decisions made without the digital infrastructure modern medicine has come to depend upon. And this is precisely why the repair timeline matters so much more than the initial attack itself. Because mainstream discussion often frames submarine cable repair as though it were simply a matter of dispatching enough repair ships quickly. But the real limitation is not resources alone, it is physics. Repairing a severed submarine cable is an extraordinarily complex sequence of operations constrained by geography, weather, ocean depth, and the technical realities of undersea engineering. The process begins with fault localization. A cable does not broadcast its exact breakpoint when severed. Monitoring systems confirm signal loss, but determining the precise location requires specialized diagnostic methods such as time domain reflectometry. Engineers send signals through the damaged cable and measure the time required for reflections to return from the fault point. Even under ideal conditions, this method narrows the location only to within roughly 1 kilometer of cable length. And 1 kilometer on the ocean floor is not a small search area. Cable routes shift over time due to currents, seabed movement, and sediment conditions. Locating a precise breakpoint on the deep ocean floor requires survey operations that themselves can consume days. Under normal circumstances, locating a single cable fault on a well-mapped route in favorable weather may take between 48 and 72 hours. But the scenario you describe involves 42 separate breaks spread across multiple ocean basins, including areas of the North Atlantic where weather conditions are among the harshest on Earth. Even the localization phase alone becomes a months-long operation requiring sequential surveys across enormous distances. And then comes the second bottleneck, the global repair fleet itself. There are only about 70 dedicated submarine cable repair ships in existence worldwide, and not all are immediately deployable at any given moment. Realistically, perhaps 15 to 20 vessels could mobilize rapidly for emergency operations. 42 simultaneous repair sites therefore cannot be repaired simultaneously, they must be queued. Some ships complete one operation before repositioning thousands of kilometers away for another. The result is a repair timeline measured not in days, but potentially in 8 to 12 months, even under optimistic assumptions. The third stage becomes even more technically difficult because most major submarine cables operate at extreme depths. Roughly 60% of the breaks in your scenario occur below 3,000 meters, where repair operations require sophisticated, remotely operated vehicles capable of functioning under immense pressure while performing delicate manipulation tasks. The damaged cable must be located precisely, lifted carefully from the seabed, brought toward the surface, spliced, tested, and then relayed onto the ocean floor without introducing additional structural weakness. Each deepwater repair sequence may require nearly a week of continuous ROV operations under ideal conditions. Multiply that by dozens of severed locations across multiple oceans, and the scale of the challenge becomes staggering. But the most strategically important factor is not even technical, it is operational interference, because repair ships attempting to restore connectivity would operate in waters where hostile naval assets remain present. If the same Russian vessels or submarines responsible for the original severance remain nearby, they possess the ability to harass repair crews, monitor operations, pressure civilian repair vessels, or even recut restored sections. And this changes the nature of the timeline entirely. The repair schedule ceases to be purely an engineering problem and becomes part of the broader geopolitical conflict itself. In that environment, restoration is no longer bounded simply by how quickly technicians can splice fiber optic lines. It becomes bounded by whether the strategic confrontation producing the cuts is resolved politically or militarily. And this leads directly to the deeper strategic logic behind the cable operation itself. The severance campaign is not fundamentally about disabling internet access as an end goal. It is about reshaping the operational environment in which every other dimension of geopolitical competition unfolds. From Moscow's perspective, the attack simultaneously degrades multiple pillars of Western strategic advantage using a single coordinated action. Financial warfare becomes harder to enforce because sanctions depend upon functioning banking infrastructure, transaction monitoring, payment routing systems, and international financial communication networks. Western governments spent years weaponizing interconnected finance against Russia through sanctions, asset freezes, and payment restrictions. But a severely degraded financial network cannot process those mechanisms efficiently. By damaging the infrastructure underlying financial globalization itself, Russia, in your scenario, is effectively attacking the enforcement mechanism behind economic warfare. The military implications are equally important. Modern NATO and American doctrine is built around high-bandwidth warfare, massive real-time intelligence sharing, constant surveillance integration, distributed command systems, precision targeting coordination, and data-heavy operational synchronization. Russian doctrine, by contrast, has historically been designed for lower bandwidth and more decentralized operational environments. When submarine cable severance forces NATO communications onto limited satellite systems with dramatically reduced bandwidth, the operational environment itself changes. American and NATO forces lose part of the informational density that gives them overwhelming advantage. Russian forces, structured for more degraded communication conditions, become relatively more competitive inside the lower bandwidth environment created by the attack. In other words, the cable severance does not merely reduce communications capacity, it alters the battlefield conditions in a way that disproportionately disadvantages Western doctrine. The political dimension may ultimately matter even more than the military one. $40 billion per day in economic disruption, financial transaction paralysis, supply chain delays, and collapsing digital services generate domestic political pressure inside Western democracies extremely quickly. Citizens experiencing banking disruptions, shortages, service outages, or business collapse are unlikely to interpret the crisis purely through abstract geopolitical frameworks. They experience it personally, and democratic governments must respond to public frustration. Russia, in your narrative, is therefore not only buying military advantage through communications disruption, it is buying political pressure time. The longer the disruption lasts, the greater the internal pressure on Western governments to negotiate an outcome restoring stability, regardless of broader strategic objectives. And finally, there is the intelligence dimension. Military communications shifted from protected cable systems onto satellite networks become significantly more exposed to interception and monitoring. Fiber optic cable traffic is physically difficult to access except at landing points or specialized intercept sites. Satellite transmissions, by contrast, radiate across broad coverage footprints accessible to signals intelligence platforms operating across multiple regions. By forcing NATO communications into a satellite-heavy environment, Russia not only degrades bandwidth but also moves alliance communications into the collection environment, where Russian SIGINT capabilities possess comparative advantage. That is what makes the operation strategically elegant from the Russian perspective described in your script. A single coordinated infrastructure campaign simultaneously degrades sanctions enforcement, reduces NATO command bandwidth, increases Western economic pressure, complicates intelligence security, disrupts cloud infrastructure, destabilizes supply chains, and fractures public confidence in the resilience of modern globalization itself. It is not merely an internet attack. It is an attack on the hidden connective architecture underlying Western power projection in the 21st century. In Beijing, the submarine cable operation is being analyzed through two separate but deeply interconnected strategic frameworks, and together they are producing what may be the most urgent Chinese geopolitical calculation since the orbital nuclear delivery tests that first demonstrated Beijing's willingness to challenge foundational assumptions of American strategic dominance. The first framework is Taiwan. The undersea cable infrastructure connecting Taiwan to the global communication system runs through maritime approaches adjacent to areas where Chinese naval forces already operate routinely. For years, Chinese survey ships, research vessels, and naval assets have conducted persistent mapping operations around those routes under the cover of scientific activity, maritime research, and seabed analysis. The Russian cable operation, in your scenario, has now provided something Chinese planners value enormously, a validated operational template, because the strategic brilliance of cable severance is that it produces many of the practical effects of a blockade without necessarily crossing the legal threshold a blockade traditionally represents. A blockade is an overt military action. It is internationally recognizable, politically escalatory, and legally difficult to disguise. But a severed submarine cable can be framed as infrastructure failure, technical malfunction, or maritime accident. And if Taiwan's international communications infrastructure were degraded severely enough through undersea disruption, the island could experience operational isolation without a single Chinese warship formally declaring a blockade perimeter. That distinction matters enormously in Beijing's calculations because Chinese grand strategy has consistently emphasized achieving strategic outcomes while delaying or blurring the thresholds that trigger unified international response. The lesson Chinese analysts would extract from the Russian operation is not simply that cables are vulnerable. That fact was already understood. The lesson is that coordinated cable warfare can create massive political, economic, and operational disruption while preserving ambiguity long enough to complicate adversary decision-making. Yantar-class equivalents China has reportedly used to survey undersea infrastructure near Taiwan for years now appear less like passive research assets and more like the preparatory layer of a future gray zone operational doctrine. The Russian operation in this framework becomes a proof of concept for how seabed warfare can reshape the strategic environment before conventional military escalation even begins. The second Chinese analytical framework is financial. China possesses the largest foreign exchange reserves in the world, roughly $3 trillion in holdings deeply connected to the operation of the international financial system. On the surface, the paralysis of submarine cable infrastructure harms Chinese financial interests alongside Western ones because China remains integrated into global trade and international payments architecture. But the asymmetry matters more than the disruption itself. China's domestic payment systems, state-controlled banking networks, and internal digital economy are less dependent on international submarine cable connectivity than the globally integrated financial systems of the United States and Europe. Western economies are structured around continuous high-speed international synchronization, cloud platforms, financial clearing systems, multinational supply chain management, AI infrastructure, and globally distributed corporate operations. China's system, by contrast, retains a greater degree of centralized domestic functionality, insulated from portions of the global connectivity environment. That means the disruption caused by mass cable severance falls disproportionately on Western economies compared to China's internal systems, and asymmetric disruption is strategically valuable. A crisis that damages your adversary's economic architecture more severely than your own becomes a geopolitical weapon, regardless of whether you remain partially affected yourself. In the scenario you describe, hundreds of millions of people across Western democracies are suddenly confronting direct daily disruption, inaccessible cloud services, failed financial transactions, communication instability, delayed logistics, interrupted streaming platforms, unstable banking applications, degraded remote work systems, and collapsing digital reliability. Those disruptions are no longer abstract geopolitical developments discussed in policy journals. They become personal experiences embedded inside ordinary civilian life. And that is the truly unprecedented aspect of the cable operation as a political weapon. Throughout history, warfare has usually imposed costs on civilian populations indirectly or geographically unevenly. Economic sanctions raise prices gradually. Conventional wars destroy infrastructure in distant regions. Military casualties affect portions of society unevenly. But the submarine cable operation described in your script connects geopolitical conflict directly to the immediate daily routines of ordinary voters across entire democracies simultaneously. The people experiencing the disruption are not analysts or policymakers alone. They are office workers unable to access cloud systems, families unable to process payments, hospitals struggling with degraded records access, students losing educational infrastructure, businesses unable to synchronize operations, and consumers suddenly discovering how completely modern life depends on invisible infrastructure they never previously considered. That creates a political pressure mechanism unlike almost anything in the history of warfare, because democracies ultimately respond to public tolerance thresholds. Citizens may support geopolitical confrontation abstractly when costs appear distant or symbolic, but when conflict begins interfering directly with ordinary daily functionality, political calculations change rapidly. Governments are no longer defending policy positions in purely strategic language. They are defending the reason people cannot access services their lives now depend upon. And that transforms the political sustainability of prolonged confrontation. Russia, in your narrative, has therefore not merely attacked infrastructure, it has linked the continuation of geopolitical conflict directly to the lived daily inconvenience of civilian populations inside Western democracies.